The German pilot saw the American fighter and laughed. It was enormous, thick, bulky. It looked less like a fighter and more like someone had strapped wings onto a flying barrel, compared to the sleek lines of the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the deadly elegance of the Focke-Wulf FW 190. The American plane looked ridiculous. Heavy, slow, overbuilt. German pilots even gave it a nickname, the Jug. Not exactly a compliment, but something strange started happening in the skies over Europe in 1943. The pilots who laughed at the Jug stopped coming back. And the plane they mocked, America's Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, quietly became one of the most lethal aircraft of the entire war. To understand why, you have to understand what the P-47 was actually built to do, because the Thunderbolt was never meant to win beauty contests. It was designed to survive a nightmare. At first glance, the P-47 looked absurd for a fighter. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. Early models were larger than some light bombers. Its fuselage was thick. Its nose was massive, and its wings were stubby compared to the razor-sharp fighters dominating European skies. But the strange shape wasn't a mistake. It was the price of an idea. That idea revolved around one machine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This was one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. An 18-cylinder radial monster capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. But there was a catch. The engine was huge. Radial engines look like giant metal flowers, cylinders sticking out in a circle. That meant the nose of the aircraft had to be wide enough to fit it, which meant drag, which meant weight. Then the designers added something else, a turbocharger, not the small mechanical supercharger used in most fighters. The P-47 used a massive exhaust-driven turbocharger buried deep inside the fuselage. Pipes ran from the engine all the way to the tail and back again. This allowed the engine to breathe at extreme altitudes, which meant the P-47 could fight where bombers flew. But again, there was a price. More pipes, more ducting, more weight. By the time the design was finished, the Thunderbolt had become the heaviest single-engine fighter in the world. German pilots looked at it and saw a target, because in a traditional dogfight, tight turns, quick climbs, knife-edge maneuvers, weight is death. And early on, they were partly right, when the P-47 first entered combat. In 1943, German fighters could outturn it, sometimes outclimb it too, but that comparison missed the point. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to turn with German fighters. It was designed to dive through them like a meteor. Here's where the math gets uncomfortable. Speed in a dive depends heavily on weight. A heavier aircraft builds momentum faster, and the P-47 was incredibly heavy. Add to that a thick, extremely strong airframe, and the Thunderbolt could survive dive speeds that would literally rip other fighters apart. Pilots quickly discovered something astonishing. Once the P-47 pointed its nose downward, almost nothing could catch it. German fighters trying to follow would often hit structural limits before the Thunderbolt did. Some pilots reported dive speeds approaching 500 miles per hour at a time when many fighters struggled to reach 400 in level flight. The Jug wasn't a knife fighter. It was a sledgehammer. American pilots developed a tactic called boom and zoom. Climb high, dive fast, fire, then climb back into the sky before the enemy could react. The P-47 was perfect for this. At altitude it was fast, in a dive it was terrifying, and when it fired like a freight train. Because the Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, 8 each firing hundreds of rounds per minute. That meant roughly 100 rounds per second tearing through the air when the pilot squeezed the trigger. German aircraft weren't built to absorb that kind of punishment. Few things were. But the Thunderbolt had another advantage. It could take punishment too. If the P-47 had a superpower, it was durability. Radial engines are naturally tough. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, they don't rely on fragile radiators. Shoot a radiator and the engine dies within minutes, but shoot a radial engine and sometimes it keeps running. The Thunderbolt also had thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and an incredibly strong fuselage. Stories started spreading among Allied pilots. P-47s returning to base with half a wing missing, aircraft riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, engines still running, pilots still alive. 2 German gunners, the Jug began to feel less like a fighter and more like an armored vehicle that had accidentally learned how to fly. But the real twist in the Thunderbolt story came later in the war, because its greatest contribution wasn't in dogfights at all. It was on the ground. By 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had changed. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Western Europe, what would become D-Day. That meant armies moving across France. Armies need protection from the air. And the P-47 turned out to be perfect for a brutal new role, ground attack. Remember all that weight? It meant the Thunderbolt could carry an absurd amount of ordnance, bombs, rockets, fuel tanks. Fully loaded, a P-47 could carry more payload than some early bombers, and it could deliver that payload with terrifying precision. Thunderbolt pilots started hunting trains, convoys, bridges, fuel depots, anything that moved on the German side of the front. The Germans soon gave the aircraft a new nickname, Der Jabbo, short for Jagged Bomber Fighter Bomber. And when the scream of a diving Thunderbolt echoed over a road, German soldiers learned to run, because the P-47 didn't just drop bombs. Its strafed, 850 caliber machine guns could shred trucks, locomotives, artillery positions, and even lightly armored vehicles. One pass from a Thunderbolt could destroy an entire convoy. And unlike fragile fighters, the Jug could fly straight into anti-aircraft fire and survive, which meant pilots used it aggressively, sometimes recklessly. There are accounts of Thunderbolts flying through curtains of flak, delivering rockets at point-blank range, then climbing away trailing smoke. Other fighters might not have made it home. The Jug often did. By the final year of the war, the aircraft that German pilots once laughed at had become one of the most feared machines over. Europe, more than 15,000 P-47s were built. They flew over 500,000 combat sorties. They destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air. But their most devastating impact came on the ground. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying tens of thousands of trucks, locomotives, and armored vehicles. They turned roads into death traps, supply lines into ruins. Movement during daylight became almost impossible for German forces in many regions. It was a quiet kind of air superiority, not flashy dogfights, just relentless pressure. Every road, every train, every convoy. At any moment, the sky might drop a Thunderbolt on you, and suddenly the Jug didn't look so funny anymore. There's an irony hiding in the Thunderbolt story. When engineers first built it, many critics thought it was too heavy to succeed, too big, too clumsy, too different from the elegant fighters dominating the skies. But war has a way of exposing assumptions, because the P-47 wasn't optimized for one narrow idea of aerial combat. It was optimized for survival, speed in a dive, brutal firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. In other words, it was designed for the messy reality of war, not the clean geometry of a dogfight diagram, and that made it terrifyingly effective. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Thunderbolt had helped crush German air power and devastate its ground logistics. The pilots who once laughed at the flying barrel had learned a brutal lesson. The ugliest machine in the sky might also be the most dangerous, and sometimes the aircraft that looks wrong turns out to be exactly right, which raises a strange question. If the P-47 was so effective, so durable, so heavily armed, so capable, why did later fighter designs move in the opposite direction? Lighter, sleeker, less armored. Why did the philosophy behind the Jug quietly disappear? Because the next revolution in air combat was already arriving, and against that new threat, even the unstoppable Thunderbolt had one weakness: speed, not in a dive, but in a world that was about to become jet-powered.